Do you believe in free speech? Do you believe that people should be judged by their character, not their skin color? Do you believe in freedom of religion? If you believe these things, you're probably not a progressive. You might think you're a progressive. I used to think I was. My show, The Rubin Report, was originally part of the Progressive Young Turks network. Progressives struck me as liberals, but louder. Progressives were the nice guys. They looked out for the little guy. They cared about women and minorities. They embraced change. In short, who wouldn't want to be a progressive? But over the last couple of years, the meaning of the word progressive has changed. Progressives used to say, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. Not anymore.
If we take the long-term historical view, yes, free speech is in better shape than in the 17th century, or in the 18th century, or even in the beginning of the 20th century. No doubt about that. But if we look in a shorter-term perspective, let's say the past 20, 30 years, I think free speech is in worse shape. Free speech is in bad standing. You can see it when you check out statistics. Freedom House puts out a report every year. Reporters Without Borders in Europe do the same thing, and other institutions. And the trend is the same all over. That for the past approximately 10 years, freedom of the press and freedom of speech is in decline.
Banning speakers whose opinions you don't agree with from college campuses, that's not progressive. Prohibiting any words not approved of as politically correct, that's not progressive. Putting trigger warnings on books, movies, music, anything that might offend people, that's not progressive either. All of this has led me to believe that much of the left is no longer progressive, but regressive. This is one of the reasons I've spent so much time on my show talking about the regressive left. This regressive ideology doesn't judge people as individuals, but as a collective. If you're black or female or Muslim or Hispanic or member of any other minority group, you're judged differently than the most evil of all things, a white Christian male. The regressive left ranks minority groups in a pecking order to compete in a kind of oppression Olympics. Gold medal goes to the most offended.
The first half of 2015, France, of all countries in the world, was the most dangerous place to live for a journalist.
Meaning that you would get arrested or you would get beaten up? Meaning that
12 people were being gunned down in January 2015. So that's of course not the case anymore, but a couple of years ago I interviewed the most famous French cartoonist Plantu, who works for Le Monde, and I asked him, when was the last time a cartoonist was killed in Europe? And he couldn't recall. The only name he came up with was a Palestinian cartoonist who was killed in London in 1987, either by the Mossad or the PLO. But even Henri Daumier, the most famous French cartoonist who worked in the 19th century, he was sent to jail several times, but he came out and he continued mocking the king. He was not killed. He was not physically threatened.
Religious moderation prevents us from even noticing the differences among our religions. It is taboo to notice that all our religions are not teaching the same thing. They're not all equally wise, and where they do teach the same thing, they don't teach it equally well. I mean, where are the Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers? If you think for a moment that the kind of violence we see in the Muslim world is born of the Israeli occupation and our misadventures in Iraq, we should see Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers. The Tibetans have suffered an occupation every bit as brutal and far more cynical than any that we or the British or the Israelis have imposed upon the Muslim world. Something like 1 million, 1.2 million Tibetans have died since the Chinese occupation. Where are the throngs of Tibetans in the streets calling for the deaths of Chinese non-combatants? Where are the Tibetans blowing themselves up on Chinese buses, at weddings, in crowds of children, in front of the offices of the Red Cross and the UN? It's not happening. It's not likely to happen.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that his children would be judged by their character and not their skin color was a liberal idea, but these days it's not a progressive ideal. And what about religious freedom, the idea that no one else can tell you what you have to believe? Surely progressives still support that basic right. Well, not so much.
Tolerance is not a demand that you put on the speaker. Mm-hmm. It's not a demand that you put on somebody who publishes a cartoon or writes a novel or paints a painting. It's on the one who watches a cartoon, watches a movie, reads a novel, that they don't tear it apart or they want to ban it or use violence against cartoonists. That is what tolerance is about. Today it means quite the opposite, you may have a right to say what you say, but if you're tolerant, you shut up.
It's not that you could not possibly form a death cult out of the principles of Tibetan Buddhism. In fact, to some degree, Zen Buddhism informed the worldview of the kamikaze pilots during World War II. But you would have to work very hard to bend the core principles of Buddhism into this kind of orgy of violence. You don't have to work so hard as a Muslim. And it would be impossible as a Jain. I mean, the Jains, this religion of India that has some 10 million subscribers, I think, the core of their religion is nonviolence. No matter how deranged you get by your doctrine as a Jain, you will get less and less violent. I mean, the really religious Jains cover their mouths with cheesecloths so they don't inhale a bug. By no stretch of the imagination can you argue that the core principle of Islam is nonviolence. It is taboo to notice this, and it is especially taboo among religious moderates. Our own religious demagogues will notice this. We can have, Franklin Graham will stand up and say Islam is an evil religion. They'll notice the differences between religions. Everyone else has the wrong religion. But religious moderates have rendered this taboo.
I'm a classical liberal, a free thinker, and as much as I don't like to admit it, defending my liberal values has suddenly become a conservative position. So if you think people should be able to say what they think without being punished for it, that people should be judged by their behavior, not their skin color, and that people should be able to live the way that they want to live without government interference, then there's not much left on the left for you.
I want to point out that I'm not talking about a race or ethnicity. I'm talking about the consequences of ideas. When I talk about Islam, I'm talking about John Walker Lynn, the white guy from Marin County who went off to fight with the Taliban. We are at war, to digress briefly into our current situation, we are at war with Islamic fundamentalism. Not merely Al-Qaeda, not extremist Islam. The mainstream doctrine of Islam contains this notion of martyrdom and jihad. It contains this imperative to convert, subjugate, or kill infidels. Anyone who says it doesn't has not read the Quran, has not read the Hadith.
Today's progressivism has become a faux moral movement hurling charges of racism, bigotry, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, and a slew of other meaningless buzzwords at anyone they disagree with.
I'm sure there are people in this room who are still thinking, no, it can't be religion. This is lack of economic opportunity. It's lack of educational opportunity in the Muslim world. Just contemplate for a moment the biographies of the 19 men who woke up on September 11th, 2001 and decided to slit the throats of stewardesses and fly planes into buildings. Okay, these guys were college educated to a man. Many of them had PhDs. Many of them had been educated in the West. They were middle class or better. I don't know how many architects and engineers need to hit the wall at 400 miles an hour for us to get it into our heads that this is not merely a problem of education or economics. These were not guys who had spent a lot of time agitating about regime change in the Middle East. These were guys who spent an inordinate amount of time at their local mosque in Hamburg talking about the pleasures that await martyrs in paradise and demonizing infidel culture.
The battle of ideas has been replaced by a battle of feelings, and outrage has replaced honesty. Diversity reigns supreme as long as it's not that pesky diversity of thought. This isn't the recipe for a free society, it's a recipe for authoritarianism.
This has put a huge pressure on everybody to manage diversity.
Right.
And it turns out that we in the West are not very well equipped to deal with that. I think you are a little bit better at it in the United States, but in Europe, we have, in the 20th century, tried to build a sustainable peace through the creation of homogeneous nation states. Mm-hmm. After World War I, and after World War II. After World War I, we created a lot of new states.
Right, so this is like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia,
Baltic states, dissolution of four empires, creation of new states.
And those were all kind of predicated, I mean, not accurately always, but with the idea that they were creating, Czechoslovakians, they're all the same. They will get along with each other.
It was Wilson's principle of the right to self-determination of a nation. There were still minorities living on different territories, and after World War II, there was a huge population swaps, basically in Eastern Europe. Germans, Ukrainians, Poles, Romanians, Hungarians, they were moved across borders in order to create more homogeneous nations.
Right.
And that has been a kind of dirty secret of Europe.
The circumstance we are in is much more sinister than many want to realize. It is possible to be so well educated that you can build a nuclear bomb and to still think you're going to get the 72 virgins in paradise. That is how partitioned the human mind is, and that is how balkanized our discourse is. That is how immune religious propositions are to critical pressure, conversational pressure in our discourse. So the problem with religious moderation, another problem, is that moderates are blinded by their own moderation. A moderate doesn't know what it's like to be certain of paradise. A moderate doesn't know what it's like to be certain of God, to be certain that the book he keeps by his bedside is the perfect word of the creator of the universe. And so when the moderate sees the jihadist in the video camera saying things like, "We love death more than the infidel loves life," and then he blows himself up, it's the moderate who's left wondering, well, that couldn't be faith. That is propaganda, I don't know what that was, but that's not religion.